Hi and welcome to the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Premium thought at a wholesale price. Let's go back to the sources and ask the big questions. What does the text say? I'm your host, Calvinist Klein, a.k.a. Romans 9:18, a.k.a. the Joyful Christian. I'd like to invite you in this final segment looking at the life of French philosopher Victor Cousin and his attempt to bridge the gap between the older deposits of faith in the classical sources and the newer academic school of Enlightenment thinking in 19th century France. Let's enjoy.
A reading of the Wikipedia article, Victor Cousin. Text is available under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license. Our thanks to the contributors and authors at Wikipedia for the use of this article. The absolute or infinite. The absolute or infinite, that is, the unconditioned ground and source of all reality, is yet apprehended by us as an immediate datum or reality, and it is apprehended in consciousness, under its condition of distinguishing subject and object, knower and known. The doctrine of Cousin was criticised by Sir W. Hamilton in the Edinburgh Review of 1829, and also about the same time by Schelling. Hamilton's objections are as follows. The correlation of the ideas of infinite and finite does not necessarily imply their correality, as Cousin supposes. On the contrary, it is a presumption that finite is simply positive and infinite negative of the same, but the finite and infinite are simply contradictory relatives. Of these the positive alone is real, the negative is only an abstraction of the other, and in the highest generality even an abstraction of thought itself.
A study of the few sentences under this head might have obviated the trifling criticism of Hamilton's objection which has been set afloat recently, that the denial of a knowledge of the absolute or infinite implies a foregone knowledge of it. How can you deny the reality of that which you do not know? The answer to this is that in the case of contradictory statements, A and not A, the latter is a mere negation of the former, and posits nothing, and the negation of a notion with positive attributes, as the finite, does not extend beyond abolishing the given attributes as an object of thought. The infinite or non-finite is not necessarily known, ere the finite is negated, or in order to negate it. All that needs to be known is the finite itself, and the contradictory negation of it implies no positive. Non-organized may or may not correspond to a positive, that is an object or notion with qualities contradictory of the organized, but the mere sublation of the organized does not posit it, or suppose that it is known beforehand, or that anything exists corresponding to it. This is one among many flaws in the Hegelian dialectic, and it paralyzes the whole of the logic.
Secondly, the conditions of intelligence, which Cousin allows, necessarily exclude the possibility of knowledge of the absolute. They are held to be incompatible with its unity. Here Schelling and Hamilton argue that Cousin's absolute is a mere relative. Thirdly, it is objected that in order to deduce the conditioned, Cousin makes his absolute a relative, for he makes it an absolute cause, that is a cause existing absolutely under relation. As such it is necessarily inferior to the sum total of its effects, and dependent for reality on these, in a word, a mere potence or becoming. Further, as a theory of creation, it makes creation a necessity, and destroys the notion of the divine. Cousin made no reply to Hamilton's criticism beyond alleging that Hamilton's doctrine necessarily restricted human knowledge and certainty to psychology and logic, and destroyed metaphysics by introducing nescience and uncertainty into its highest sphere, theodicy.
The attempt to render the laws of reason or thought impersonal by professing to find them in the sphere of spontaneous apperception, and above reflective necessity, is unsuccessful. Cause, substance, time, space, are given us as realized in a particular form. In no single act of affirmation of cause or substance, much less in such a primitive act, do we affirm the universality of their application. There may be particular instances or cases of these laws, but we could never get the laws themselves in their universality, far less absolute impersonality. No amount of individual instances of the application of any of them by us would give it a true universality. The only sure test we have of their universality in our experience is the test of their reflective necessity. We thus after all fall back on reflection as our ground for their universal application. Mere spontaneity of apprehension is futile. Their universality is grounded in their necessity, not their necessity in their universality. How far and in what sense this ground of necessity renders them personal are of course questions still to be solved.
But if these three correlative facts are immediately given, it seems to be thought possible by Cousin to vindicate them in reflective consciousness. He seeks to trace the steps which the reason has spontaneously and consciously, but reflectively, followed. And here the question arises, can we vindicate in a reflective or mediate process this spontaneous apprehension of reality? The self. The self is found to be a cause of force, free in its action, on the ground that we are obliged to relate the volition of consciousness to the self as its cause, and its ultimate cause. It is not clear from the analysis whether the self is immediately observed as an acting or originating cause, or whether reflection working on the principle of causality is compelled to infer its existence and character. If self is actually so given, we do not need the principle of causality to infer it. If it is not so given, causality could never give us either the notion or the fact of self as a cause or force, far less as an ultimate one. All that it could do would be to warrant a cause of some sort, but not this or that reality as the cause. And further, the principle of causality, if fairly carried out, as universal and necessary, would not allow us to stop at personality or will as the ultimate cause of its effect, volition. Once applied to the facts at all, it would drive us beyond the first antecedent or term of antecedents of volition to a still further cause or ground, in fact, land us in an infinite regress of causes.
The same criticism is even more emphatically applicable to the influence of a not-self, or world of forces, corresponding to our sensations, and the cause of them. Starting from sensation as our basis, causality could never give us this, even though it be allowed that sensation is impersonal to the extent of being independent of our volition. Causality might tell us that a cause there is of sensation somewhere and of some sort, but that this cause is a force or sum of forces, existing in space, independently of us, and corresponding to our sensations. It could never tell us, for the simple reason that such a notion is not supposed to exist in our consciousness. Causality cannot add to the number of our notions, and cannot add to the number of realities we know. All it can do is to necessitate us to think that a cause there is of a given change, but what the cause is it cannot of itself inform us, or even suggest to us, beyond implying that it must be to the effect. Sensation might arise, for aught we know, so far as causality leads us, not from a world of forces at all, but from a will like our own, though infinitely more powerful, acting upon us, partly furthering and partly thwarting us, and indeed such a supposition is, with the principle of causality at work, within the limits of probability, as we are already supposed to know such a reality, a will, in our own consciousness. When Cousin thus set himself to vindicate those points by reflection, he gave up the obvious advantage of his other position that the realities in question are given us in immediate and spontaneous apprehension. The same criticism applies equally to the inference of an absolute cause from the two limited forces which he names self and not self. Immediate spontaneous apperception may seize this supreme reality, but to vindicate it by reflection as an inference on the principle of causality is impossible. This is a mere paralogism. We can never infer either absolute or infinite from relative or finite.
The truth is that Cousin's doctrine of the spontaneous apperception of impersonal truth amounts to little more than a presentment in philosophical language of the ordinary convictions and beliefs of mankind. This is important as a preliminary stage, but philosophy properly begins when it attempts to coordinate or systematize those convictions in harmony, to conciliate apparent contradiction and opposition, as between the correlative notions of finite and infinite, the apparently conflicting notions of personality and infinitude, self and not self. In a word, to reconcile the various sides of consciousness with each other, and whether the laws of our reason are the laws of all intelligence and being, whether and how we are to relate our fundamental, intellectual and moral conceptions to what is beyond our experience, or to an infinite being, are problems which Cousin cannot be regarded as having solved. These are in truth the outstanding problems of modern philosophy.
Cousin's doctrine of spontaneity and volition can hardly be said to be more successful than his impersonality of the reason through volition spontaneous apperception. Sudden, unpremeditated volition may be the earliest and the most artistic, but it is not the best. Volition is essentially a free choice between alternatives, and that is best which is most deliberate, because it is most rational. Aristotle touched this point in his distinction. The sudden and unpremeditated wish represented by the former is wholly inferior in character to the free choice of the latter, guided and illumined by intelligence. In this we can deliberately resolve upon what is in our power, in that we are subject to the vain impulse of wishing the impossible. Spontaneity is pleasing, sometimes beautiful, but it is not in this instance the highest quality of the thing to be obtained, that is to be found in a guiding and illumining reflective activity.
Eclecticism is not open to the superficial objection of proceeding without a system or test in determining the complete or incomplete, but it is open to objection, assuming that a particular analysis of consciousness has reached all the possible elements in humanity and in history, and all their combinations. It may be asked, can history have that which is not in the individual consciousness? In a sense not, but our analysis may not give all that is there, and we ought not at once to impose that analysis or any formula on history. History is as likely to reveal to us in the first place true and original elements, and combinations of elements in man, as a study of consciousness. Besides, the tendency of applying a formula of this sort to history is to assume that the elements are developed in a certain regular and necessary order, whereas this may not at all be the case, but we may find at any epoch the whole mixed, either crossing or cooperative, as in the consciousness of the individual himself. Further, the question as to how these elements may possibly have grown up in the general consciousness of mankind is assumed to be non-existent or impossible.
It was the tendency of the philosophy of Cousin to outline things and to fill up the details in an artistic and imaginative interest. He was observational and generalizing rather than analytic and discriminating. His search into principles was not profound, and his power of rigorous consecutive development was limited. He left no distinctive permanent principle of philosophy, but he left very interesting psychological analyses, and several new, just, and true expositions of philosophical systems, especially that of Locke and the philosophers of Scotland. He was at the same time a man of impressive power, of rare and wide culture, and of lofty aim, far above priestly conception and Philistine narrowness. He was familiar with the broad lines of most systems of philosophy. His eclecticism was proof of a reverential sympathy with the struggles of human thought to attain to certainty in the highest problems of speculation. It was a doctrine of comprehension and toleration, forming a marked and valuable contrast to the arrogance of absolutism, to the dogmatism of sensationalism, and to the doctrine of church authority, preached by the theological school of his day. His spirit saved the youth of France from these other influences. As an educational reformer and a man of learning, who greatly influenced others, Cousin stands out among the memorable Frenchmen of the 19th century.
Sir W. Hamilton, one of his most resolute opponents, described Cousin as a profound and original thinker, a lucid and eloquent writer, a scholar equally at home in ancient and in modern learning, a philosopher superior to all prejudices of age or country, party or profession, and whose lofty eclecticism, seeking truth under every form of opinion, traces its unity even through the most hostile systems. Influence. Among those influenced by Cousin were Edgar Allan Poe, Théodore Simon Geoffroy, Jean-Philibert Dameron, Adolphe Garnier, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Jules Barthélemy Saint-Hilaire, Félix Hervé Saint-Malin, Charles de Rémusat, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Jules Simon, Paul Janet, Adolphe Frank and Patrick Edward Dove, who dedicated his The Theory of Human Progression to him. Geoffroy and Dameron were first fellow followers, then students and then disciples. Geoffroy always kept firm to the early, the French and Scottish, impulses of Cousin's teaching. Cousin continued to lecture for 2.5 years after his return to the chair. Sympathizing with the Revolution of July, he was at once recognized by the new government as a friend of national liberty. Writing in June 1833, he explains both his philosophical and his political position. For many years I was opposed by both the sensational and the theological school. In 1830 they descended into politics. The sensational school organically developed into the party of demagogy, and the theological school were absolutists, and borrowed demagogy, from time to time, in order the better to reach its ends. With its philosophy it uses skepticism for other positions as a fuel to restore theocracy. On the other hand, one who combated any exclusive principle in science would similarly reject also any exclusive principle in the state, and to defend representative government. His most important work was in organizing teaching in France's primary schools and universities. Cousin followed the models of Prussia and Saxony, adopted the examples of universities of Austerlitz and Jena, overlooked the issues associated with recent national calamities to make a series of influential reports that were readily accepted by the French, and led to laws defining public instruction at the universities. After adoption in France, the documents he wrote made it into the English-speaking world, and was widely reflected in schools in the United States, notably New Jersey and Massachusetts. His stand on a middle ground between absolutist and theocratic excesses of religion, and the libertine approach of the secularists while promoting a national pride were a revitalizing standard.
And so we have it. The life and work and thought of French philosopher Victor Cousin, who shared that the absolute or infinite, that is, the unconditioned ground and source of all reality, is yet apprehended by the human subject, and it is apprehended through human consciousness, and distinguishes between subject and object, between the knower and that which is known. This section of our treatment of Cousin was entitled The Absolute and the Self because it was very striking to me as I prepared this, that in dealing with the absolute and the self, Cousin was really struggling with, as the 19th century thinkers were in general, with this idea that John Calvin, Reformed philosopher and theologian, had talked about several hundred years earlier, the loci of knowledge. In his Institutes, Calvin talked about the doctrine of God and the doctrine of man, and that to know God, one must first know man, but to know man, one must first know God. And from these two points of reference came all of the perspective and all of the knowledge and all of the deposit of information about the reality of the world. And of course, in Calvin's case, this included the Christian understanding of God. So now we're perhaps 250 years later, and the Enlightenment thinkers are really struggling with the same thing. Sure, the terminology has changed from the doctrine of God and the doctrine of man to the idea of the absolute and the self. And so in that sense, the Enlightenment may be regarded from a Christian perspective as a declension, as a decline, as moving from something of higher clarity and conceptual value to something of lower value. Trading in our Spanish leather for perhaps inferior goods. But that's an argument for another day. Thank you for listening to these essays. For the Philosopher's Clearinghouse, this is Romans 9:18.